Captain's log, stardate. I don't know. The battery died on the ship's clock, and Scotty won't change it until I apologize for saying his accent wasn't realistic. Starfleet Command have sent us on a new mission to review Star Trek the Motion Picture. Mr. Spock, what can you tell us about this film? It's known colloquially as the slow motion picture, Captain. While it may be the first cinema outing of the original Star Trek cast, it's also widely regarded as one of the weakest in the entire Trek film canon. I see. This may be a daunting mission, then. Indeed, Captain. However, it is really a story of two films, one good and one bad. Star Trek the Motion Picture had a very painful journey through development hell. According to various biographies, the studio wanted Star Trek to return after it had become a big hit in syndication, and originally it was going to come back in the form of a new TV series, then as a TV movie of sorts. And then finally, the studio decided it was going to return as a big-budget sci-fi film extravaganza. With all these rising stakes, the studio wanted a big story to make their investment worth it. Ah, I remember now. The writers provided and the script was turned down. So they provided again, and the script was turned down. Paramount kept saying the story wasn't big enough, even though one of these story outlines had the Enterprise rushing about the universe, trying to save all life as we know it. What's bigger than saving the entire universe? Your guess is as good as mine. Quite. Eventually, and through a process I still don't have quite clear in my mind, the studio finally gave the go-ahead to heavily rework the pilot script from the aborted Star Trek Phase 2 TV series, which at one point also seemed to have been the script for the aborted TV movie as well, from what I have read, but it gets a bit mingled, and seems to depend on which website you read, so take from that what you will, Captain. Captain, reports indicate the production went massively over budget, something that became a running joke on set. People would arrive in the morning and ask how far over budget they already were that day. This isn't exactly what you want to hear if you're involved in a film, but when you watch the finished product, you can see where a lot of the money was wasted. Those effect shots, the lingering shots of spaceships, and people in jetpack suits floating around, and the massive sets that are only used once, then are discarded. It all costs money that could definitely have been better used. Still, we have to take the film as it stands, and review it for what we actually see. And what we see is a massive amount of scenery porn, glamour shots for spaceships, and lingering shots of the crew looking at scenery porn and glamour shots of spaceships. It's no wonder the film got the nickname the slow motion picture. All these shots are unnecessary. But here's the thing, there is a good film in here if you're able to get past all the bad stuff. At its core, this is a great piece of science fiction, with a compelling narrative and some great acting. And the vast majority of it is backloaded into the second half of the film. Aye, Captain. Once the Enterprise encounters V'Ger and the scenery porn starts to die off, the film really picks up the pace. The slowness disappears and we go from Star Trek pretending to be 2001: A Space Odyssey to Star Trek being Star Trek. Kirk, Spock and McCoy all get their chances to shine, with some great interpersonal scenes and wonderful interactions with Decker and Ilya, the two canon immigrant characters who were imported from the script's original incarnation as the pilot for Phase 2. Mr. Sulu is correct, Captain. Ilya plays her dual role very well, and I could see some excellent scenes here. She's basically a prototype of Lieutenant Commander Data from The Next Generation in the second half of the film, while in the first half she's very much what Counselor Troi would become in The Next Generation, even down to her past romantic interests with Decker, who firmly fits into his role as the proto-Riker. It's interesting to see how Star Trek reuses old ideas to create new, compelling characters. I quite agree, Mr. Spock. Speaking of reusing ideas, this film's plot in the second half basically comes down to a rehash of the original series episode The Changeling, with V'Ger taking the role of Nomad from the original episode. That's not necessarily a bad thing, of course, because, as we said earlier, the second half of this film is compelling viewing, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's a little annoying when you spot the similarities, of course, because you kind of know where the story is going to go once you've picked up on the similarities, but it's still a lot of fun. Indeed. Nevertheless, we have to address the fact that the first half of the film is slow, mostly pointless, and turns the viewer off from the story. We have been watching the director's edition of the film for this mission, because it's arguably the better cut, but even then there is a lot of slowness and pointless lingering that's seriously off-putting. If I were making my own cut of the film, I'd cut the space shots down to 20% of their runtime because they kill the pacing of the film. The transporter mishap scene would be axed in its entirety, and so would everything we see of Mr. Spock on Vulcan. The majority of the Klingon scenes would be merged into the briefing from Starbase Epsilon that Captain Kirk receives while briefing the crew, and we would open the film with the Klingons firing at the space cloud, then being destroyed. Cut to Starbase Epsilon long enough for them to say that they've detected the Klingons fighting something, and that the something is on course for Earth. Then jump immediately to Captain Kirk arriving at Starfleet Command. Chop a lot more scenes down for time, and then get Kirk onto the Enterprise as quickly as possible. Keep all the glamour shots of the Enterprise for when it leaves space dock, otherwise you're losing the "what does the ship look like" anticipation that you could otherwise have. When the Enterprise leaves space dock, get some glamour shots to please fans, because by now they deserve to see the ship. Then hack 90% of the wormhole sequence out of the film. It's there to show Decker knows the ship better than Kirk, but we don't want to give the impression that Kirk is recklessly endangering the ship, because he is not. He's trying to get to the space cloud on time to save everyone. He's not just going for a joyride. I quite agree. After that, get Spock on board in a drastically cut-down sequence that omits all but the bare minimum of shots of the docking sequence with his weird detachable ship. Then get the Enterprise warping to Vija. Once all that's done, the rest of the film can proceed as it's shown in the director's edition, because, as we said earlier, that half of the film is great and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So, there we have it. Star Trek, the motion picture, is a film that has a good half and a bad half. The good half is excellent. The bad half is pretty much skippable. Unfortunately, it's the bad half that people remember the most, probably because the good half is a rehash of an episode of the original series. Is it as bad as people say it is? No, I don't think it is. When it's good, it's very good. And that's why I'm going to give it 2 out of 5 phases. If you liked today's video, please consider supporting me on Patreon. And an extra special thanks goes out to Chief89 and Tepic. Thank you.